The steel is 18.5 millimeters thick in places where German naval doctrine said 14 would do. That is the first thing Flight Lieutenant David Hathaway wrote in his report. Not the size of the vessel, not the state it arrived in. The steel, the thickness of steel that no engineering specification required, in a submarine that had been fighting a war for 4 years and had no reason to be built to any standard higher than survival. The boat was U-534, a Type 9 C/40 ocean-going U-boat surrendered intact in May 1945 and eventually transferred to British Technical Intelligence at Barrow-in-Furness for full structural examination. She was 87.6 metres long. She displaced 1,144 tons submerged. She had run Atlantic patrols, survived depth charges, and come through the war without a single major structural repair to her pressure hull. The RAF engineers who boarded her in the late summer of 1945 expected to find a workhorse, competent, utilitarian, the product of a nation building submarines faster than it could crew them. What they found instead took 3 months to document and another 6 months for anyone in Whitehall to fully accept. There is a photograph taken on the first day of examination. 4 men in overalls standing beside the forward torpedo room bulkhead. One of them, a structural engineer named Geoffrey Morrow, on secondment from Vickers Armstrongs, is holding a weld seam with both hands. Not pointing at it, holding it. The way you hold something you cannot quite believe is real. What Morrow had just run his fingers across was a continuous filly weld with a surface finish so consistent that his handheld gauge could not detect a variation of more than 0.3 millimeters across a 14-meter run. In British submarine construction at the time, a tolerance of plus or minus 2 millimeters was considered acceptable. Germany was building these boats in the middle of a war under Allied bombing, with a workforce that included forced labourers and men who had never welded before 1942. The seam Morrow was touching looked like it had been laid by a machine. There were no machines capable of producing it. The examination team began at the bow and worked aft. This was standard procedure, systematic, compartment by compartment, with calipers and ultrasonic gauges, and a set of British Admiralty reference specifications that quickly became almost useless as a comparison tool. Within the first week, the team had catalogued 14 structural features that exceeded British standards. Not met them, exceeded them. Some by margins that would have been noteworthy in peacetime commercial shipbuilding. The first layer of findings centred on the pressure hull plating itself. German Type 9 boats were designed to operate at a test depth of 230 metres, with a crush depth theoretically somewhere around 300. When Morrow's team began core sampling the hull steel, they found tensile strength readings averaging 680 megapascals. British T-class submarine steel at the same period ran around 580. The German steel was not simply stronger, it was more uniform. 47 samples taken from across the hull showed a variance of less than 4% in tensile strength. 47 samples across an 87-metre vessel built in a shipyard that had been bombed 11 times. 4% variance. The team's metallurgist, a man named Arthur Pollock from the National Physical Laboratory, wrote in his interim notes, "Consistency of this order is not achievable under the conditions we are told this hull was produced. I would welcome an explanation." No explanation was forthcoming. One of the younger engineers on the team, a lieutenant named Callum Reed, who had come up through naval architecture at Glasgow, put his tea down on the engine room casing on the 9th day and did not pick it up again. He had just finished measuring the portside framing welds in the midship section, the internal ribs that gave the pressure hull its resistance to implosion, and he had found something that stopped him. The weld penetration was full. Every frame, every join, every intersection point. In British practice, full penetration welds were specified for critical structural nodes only, and even then they were inspected and sometimes fell short. Here, in a section of hull that would never be seen again once the boat was commissioned, in joints that only needed to be adequate, someone had run full penetration welds on every single frame. It added time. It added cost. It added nothing to the boat's operational capability that a surveyor would ever measure. It was done anyway. This is the kind of channel that exists because stories like this one deserve more than a footnote. If you want to know what the engineering record of the Second World War actually looked like, not the broad strokes but the specific, documented, measurable details, subscribe. There are people here who have been waiting for exactly this. The examination moved deeper into the boat. The team opened inspection panels in the ballast tank baffles, areas that, in British construction, were treated as low priority zones because they were not structural in the load-bearing sense. What they found was that the German construction teams had applied the same weld standard in the baffles as in the pressure hull itself. Same penetration depth, same surface finish, same steel grade. There was no engineering reason for this. The baffles did not need to be built this way. They were built this way regardless, as though whoever had designed the production process had simply decided that there would be one standard, applied everywhere, with no exceptions for zones that no inspector would ever scrutinize. It was at this point that the team began to understand they were not looking at a quality control story. They were looking at a cultural one. The week the examination team reached this conclusion, November 1945, the Nuremberg trials were in their third week. The news coming out of Germany was of a nation dismantling its own record, of documents burned and testimony contradicted, and men denying knowledge of things they had signed their names to. And here, in a dry dock in Barrow-in-Furness, Geoffrey Morrow and his team were holding a piece of physical evidence that could not lie, could not hedge, could not be explained away. Whoever had built this boat had built it as though the war did not excuse them from doing it properly. The team reached the diesel engine mounts in week 6. This was where they expected to find the compromises. Engine mounts are high-stress, high-vibration interfaces, and wartime production shortcuts most commonly showed up in exactly these areas because the degradation was gradual and rarely catastrophic within the operational life of the vessel. The British examination of captured Italian submarines in 1941 had found severe corrosion and microfracturing in engine mount welds within 18 months of commissioning. The team expected something similar on U-534, which had been operational since 1942. What Morrow found was that the engine mount welds showed no measurable fatigue cracking. None. On a boat that had run thousands of hours of ocean patrol, through the pressure cycles of repeated deep dives and surface running, the welds connecting 400 horsepower Mahan diesel engines to the keel structure were, by every measurable standard, as sound as the day they had been laid. Pollock, the metallurgist, asked for the engine logs. The Navy supplied them. U-534 had completed 14 operational patrols. The engines had run for an estimated 9,400 hours total. Pollock wrote 4 words in his notebook and underlined them twice. These welds should be cracked. They were not cracked. That was the problem. Not that they had found a defect, that they had failed to find one where every engineering model they possessed said one had to exist. The final layer of the examination took place in December 1945 in the aft torpedo room, in an area of the hull that had been sealed since the boat's surrender and had never been opened for any post-war inspection. When Reed cut the inspection plate and shone a light into the void space between the inner and outer hull skins, he found something that no one had anticipated and that did not appear in any German naval construction document the British had captured. The void space had been treated, manually, by hand, with what Pollock later identified as a zinc-rich primer applied over a sand-blasted surface. In a section of the boat that would be permanently inaccessible once welded shut, that would never be seen by any inspector, that served no purpose that could be identified in any specification document. Someone had painted it, properly, knowing it would never be seen again. Reed sat on the aft casing for a long time after that. The report he filed described the finding in 3 clinical sentences. But a letter he wrote to his wife that evening, which his family donated to the National Maritime Museum in 1987, said something the report did not. He wrote, "I keep thinking about the man who did it. He knew no one was coming to check. He did it anyway." The consequence of the examination was not a single decision. It was a cascade. The Admiralty circulated Morrow's final report, classified until 1972, to every major British submarine construction programme then active. The report did not recommend copying German methods. It recommended something harder, asking why British methods had drifted from the standards they claimed to hold, and what it would take to return to them. The post-war Porpoise-class submarines, commissioned from 1958, incorporated revised Weld inspection protocols that traced their direct lineage to the findings in Morrow's report. The engineers who wrote those protocols cited U534 by hull number. The broader finding that German wartime submarine construction had maintained quality standards that should have been impossible given the conditions of their production was never fully resolved. The Deschimag shipyard in Bremen, which built U534, had been bombed 14 times between 1942 and 1944. Its workforce in the final years of the war included prisoners from occupied territories working under conditions that the post-war tribunals documented in detail. The quality of the work those workers produced is one of the most uncomfortable engineering facts of the entire war. It does not resolve into a comfortable lesson. It sits there, measured and documented, refusing to behave like a story with a clean ending. U534 is in a museum in Birkenhead now. They cut her into 4 sections so visitors can walk through the interior. The hull is dark and slightly damp and smells of old steel. Most people walk through in about 20 minutes, looking at the torpedo tubes and the cramped bunks and the dials they cannot read. Very few of them stop at the hull wall. Very few of them put their hands on the steel the way Geoffrey Morrow did in 1945 and think about what it means that the weld in front of them is still, 80 years later, within tolerance. That it was built to a standard no one required in a war that excused every shortcut by people who had every reason to do less. Morrow's report ends with a single sentence that his superiors asked him to remove before the document was circulated. He refused, and it stayed. He wrote, "The quality of this construction is not the signature of a nation at war. It is the signature of people who had decided, before the war began, what kind of work they were going to do." The steel is still 18.5 millimeters thick. It was never going to be anything else.